I should say that you should feel free to ask questions while I'm lecturing. There are some classes where I can't entertain questions. The 50-minute lectures are too short, too much material, but this one is a bit longer, and usually I'll be able to entertain questions. All right, so what I'd like to do today is I'm going to be doing a number of different things. One is I'm going to give you a very brief overview of the history leading up to the mid-1940s. Just 10 minutes or so basically on British India, partly because, as I have suggested to you before, that much of the political structure of India has been inherited from the colonial period. I just taught a seminar this morning on Hindu-Muslim relations in colonial and modern India, and I was telling the class there that that if you go to these Indian public schools, so the word public there means private. Okay, this is the English usage of the word, so public schools as opposed to state-run schools. That the public schools in India, in the major metropolitan cities such as New Delhi, Bombay, I'm using the anglicized form Bombay because it was renamed into Mumbai, of course, some years ago. Calcutta, which was renamed Kolkata. Cities of that kind, but particularly Delhi and Bombay, that the students all come from overwhelmingly similar backgrounds. These elite families, largely upper caste Hindu families, and the students there are all really monolingual. I mean, it's almost astonishing. That is that even the language they speak at home is English, except when they're speaking to the servants and the maidservants and the drivers and the cooks, just as in the colonial days, But when they're talking with each other, and I know this culture very well because my children went to these schools when I had relocated back to India twice, in 2008 and 2010 for 2 years each time, and I myself am a product of one of these schools, but I'm a product at a much earlier generation where the use of English was still not overwhelming. But today, these students growing up in schools in Delhi and Bombay, they are overwhelmingly speaking in English, right? So it is important to understand a little bit of the backdrop before we move on to the 1940s. Secondly, then I'm going to discuss with you the events from the 1940s leading to the partition and ending with the assassination of Mohandas Gandhi on 30th January 1948. But I also want to show you some slides of the general topography, the general political structure, and a couple of linguistic maps of India as well. So let's begin with this, and then I'll move on to the other segments of the class. So here we're looking at South Asia, and of course you have India, Pakistan. Remember my remarks about Afghanistan. We're not really going to be looking at Afghanistan very much, but it is important to understand the long historical links between India and Afghanistan and India and Iran. For example, there were more books published in Persian in India in the 19th century than in Iran. It's an absolute fact, indisputable fact. The first Persian language newspaper in the world was published in Calcutta in 1812, not in Tehran. I mean, and that is again a demonstration of the fact that there's been long-standing links. Persian was a language of administration in British India until 1835. It was a language that they in themselves had inherited from the Mughal Empire, the preceding empire, right? So these are, again, little segments which help you understand why, when we're thinking of India, let's first have a broader view of the picture. And then we have Nepal over here, Bhutan, which I mentioned to you, landlocked country again, small mountain kingdom over there, and Bangladesh here, which used to be East Pakistan until 1971, from 1947 to 1971. Right, so that's the larger terrain to think about. This terrain is important to think about, Southeast Asia, although it's not under our purview in this course. because of, again, the long links between Southeast Asia and India. Large parts of Southeast Asia, which today I'm including Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, Cambodia, Thailand, all these countries came under what we might describe as Indic influence, right? So there's a long debate, and that debate has to do with the Indianization of Southeast Asia. And of course, there's also the Chinese spheres of influence over there, but China and India were, in a sense, the two predominant civilizations of Asia. So both of them were able to carve out certain spheres of influence. Not spheres of influence in the sense in which European powers carved out spheres of influence which were in the 19th century, which is a narrative having to do with colonialism. And there are very interesting questions about the transmission of Indian culture and Hinduism and Buddhism to places like Southeast Asia. Angkor Wat, I'm sure some of you have heard of it, but that would be an illustration of the way in which this word influence, which is not analytically a very useful word for reasons that should be clear from what I'm saying, that it can mean any number of things. But for lack of a better word, it is useful, and if we were really looking at the greater India picture, then to some degree Southeast Asia would enter into our configuration as well. And here you have a map which now focuses more on the countries of South Asia with some of the major cities. If you have an urban population of 100,000 in India, that doesn't count for a city. It has to be at least 1 million to be a city. You have small towns of 200, 300,000 here, ramshackle little places, frankly, in very bad shape, most of them. They don't really count as cities. They would count as cities in Europe, but certainly not in India. And again, there are very complicated questions, such as what makes for a city. Some people think it's simply numbers and an urban infrastructure. Well, Los Angeles is, by a traditional definition, not a city. Partly because a city has a relationship to walking. This is not a place you can walk to. And if somebody points to miserable 3rd Street downtown in Santa Monica as an illustration of a place where you can walk, then you haven't really spent any time in a city, I would say. Right? But so when we look at definitions, there are dictionary definitions, and then there are obviously what philosophers and historians and others do when they start thinking about what it means to live in a city. So the great German Jewish intellectual of the 20th century, one of the great ones, Walter Benjamin, wrote a lot about Paris, and it was partly he wrote about Paris because he walked down the length and breadth, as it were, of every city in Paris. It's a city that you can walk in, right? So these places that I identified are all as largely what you might describe as urban areas, and they may or may not count as cities in South Asia. And now we get into a map here which shows you the division of the states within India itself, and so these are the boundaries here between the states, but not entirely, because these are actually also significant roads and all of that, but they have it gives you a slightly greater idea of the density. But the reason I'm showing this map is because if you look at the key up over there, then you also see the altitude, right, at which places are, and this is the Gangetic Plains over here, where it says Uttar Pradesh, this whole area here. The Gangetic Plains has been the heart of Indian civilization, at least in the northern part of the country. The bottom here is what is called the peninsula, and of course if you go up to the mountains there, that's why it's in brown over there, because the altitude is much greater. Anything less than 12,000 feet is really the foothills of the Himalayas. The Himalayas really, in terms of mountains, you have to get to 15,000 feet and higher. So there's a enormous difference between what are called the hill people and the plains people.
This was a distinction that came about very much in the colonial period. And you know what the British did? That among other things, they shifted the capital every summer. Every summer they moved the entire capital because the plains were too hot for them, of course. You know? And they would shift it to a place like Shimla, which is up in the mountains. It's at altitude of roughly about 6,500 feet. It's called a hill station. So the British developed a lot of hill stations up there in the lower foothills. And these hill stations became, in a manner of speaking, nurseries of the English ruling class. That is, that women and children were brought there, and this is where they spent the bulk of their time. At least 6, 7, 8 months of the year, they would spend their time in these, hill stations, and there are dozens of them, mainly over there, but also some in the Darjeeling area over here, up in this part, in north, and in the less so in the extreme northeast. If you look at this map over here now, you get states and union territories, and the following map that you will see will look identical, but I'll point. So you look at the date over here. This map was 2012, and when you see the following map, you'll see one difference which is not transparent unless I point your attention to it. But this is the carving out of states in the post-1947 period. It didn't happen immediately after independence. They had to appoint a commission called the Linguistic States Reorganization Commission on Linguistic Grounds is what so in other words, what was the idea? The idea was, and again we'll delve into this in greater detail later on, that if you look at this state as an illustration, Orissa, okay? So this is an area where the predominant language would be Oriya. Then if you get to this state, what was Andhra? The predominant language would be Telugu. Tamil Nadu, predominant language, Tamil. So these states were organized according to linguistic principles of linguistic contiguity, that people who speak the same language will constitute one group. That doesn't mean that there may not be speakers of other languages in that area. It simply meant that was a predominant language. All right? And in India, post-1947, and again, I'm not giving you the exact date, simply because we're just saying it's post-47, and most of this happened in the 50s, some things that I'm describing in the 60s. They adopted what is called the three-language formula. Okay? Very simply, what that means is the following, that if you were a child growing up in Orissa, you would be instructed in your mother tongue in primary and secondary school, and the mother tongue would be Oriya in this case. Then you would also start learning Hindi, usually from grade 6 onwards, and you would start learning English, sometimes from grade 8 onwards. That's the three-language formula. So if you were in Bengal, over here, the state of West Bengal, the three-language formula would be Bengali, and then Hindi and English. And the supposition was that Hindi would be the Indian link language. Some people call it the national language. It's not the national language, right? There really is effectively no national language. You've got, and the Constitution lists 15 languages. I could bring you a banknote next time and show you the banknote so the 50 rupees currency is listed in 15 different languages. Each of these languages has a minimum of 10 million speakers, okay? Because there are, of course, a great many other languages too. There are other languages which are not listed, obviously. The Census of India enumerates hundreds of languages. And some languages have very few speakers now. So this is a phenomenon that is a worldwide phenomenon, dying languages. You have this problem in Papua New Guinea, for example, in parts of Indonesia, where again you have enormous linguistic diversity, right? But that was the three-language formula. Here's the exception. The exception was if you came from this Gangetic belt, where Indian civilization flourished, as it were, along the banks of the Ganges and the alluvial plains shaped by that, There you had basically only a two-language formula. Why? Because the mother tongue was Hindi to begin with. So therefore, since the mother tongue was Hindi for most of these people, and here I'm using Hindi simply as an aggregate term because there could be differences in the kinds of Hindi dialects, all of that, but essentially it was a two-language formula in the Hindi-speaking areas. Elsewhere in India, it was a three-language formula. And now if you look at this map, which as I said looks identical, doesn't it? But it's not. This is 2018. Why? Because this state got carved up, Andhra Pradesh, and they created a new state here, Telangana, right? Which is to say that the political constitution of India is still a work in progress, as they say, to use that English expression. States are still being carved out. This is very recent. This happened just a few years ago, right? And there is every likelihood that this will continue because there are people here particularly. This is what's called Northeast India. You'll see another map which will show you why this area is quite different. But for the moment, just accept that what you have in these states in Northeast India is in some of them you have what are called secessionist movements. People who want to break out of the state, create their own state. And there's every likelihood that at some point in the near future, a couple of new states will be carved out. That was carved out, there was a state that was carved out here, this state here called Jharkhand, okay? So the reasons for this being carved out in relatively recent years and this are quite different. That's where you get into the nitty-gritty of Indian politics, because this was basically an area largely shaped by tribal culture. So the idea was you put the tribal people in their own state. That was not the argument over here, right? This is not the reason why this was carved out. There's different arguments. So there can be different reasons. And again, over here, there would be other forces at work. I think you had raised your hand.
Was the three-language formula a deliberate attempt to help establish a national identity?
Very good question. That would be in short the logical way to look at it, because the whole idea was what makes us all Indian. If I'm a speaker of Oriya here and there's a speaker of Gujarati there, right? What's common between the two of us? So then you might say, well, maybe we worship similar gods. We may not. So is there anything that is really common? And so that was in part the rationale for the three-language formula. The recognition being that English would always be only a language of a minority. There is a common view that English is widely understood among some. That's entirely incorrect. The number of people who are actually completely fluent in English in India is much less than 50 million out of a population of 1.3 billion. But it is the language of administration along with Hindi, and generally what happens is that most documents would be produced at the central government level. In India, we don't call it the federal government. Here you call the feds and the states. In India, it's called the central government. At the central government level, many of the documents would be produced in both English and Hindi. If it's a state legislative assembly, then of course the proceedings may be in that particular language of that state, and they may be in English as well. There was a lot of anti-Hindi resentment, to continue your question, that when Hindi was seen, having the three-language formula was seen as the imposition of Hindi on people coming actually from a different language family. Because the South Indian languages, well, we'll get to that in a moment, actually the dominant South Indian languages belong to a different linguistic group than the languages spoken in North India, East India, West India. Okay? So now you see a map here which shows the language families and branches, languages and dialects. I don't remember what the last census exactly enumerated. I think about 920 languages, something of that kind. There have been previous censuses which have enumerated, of course, over 1,000 languages, but there's been some, as I've said, some language loss. Now, if you look at this map over here, there's a simpler one. I also want you to keep in mind, I'm going to give you little asides, And you know what happens is some students view these as tangents. No, idea is for you to just think about different things, because this is only the beginning of it, right? One of the things it is useful to think about is how do we deploy maps when we do work as historians, when we do work as social scientists, you know? And there are what are called cartographic wars. Sometimes countries fight wars through maps. Example, there are disputed parts of Kashmir. Now, all you have to do is look at maps of Kashmir produced by China, India, and Pakistan. And they'll show you very different history of who inhabited that disputed spot. Because when you lay claim to a place, right, what are the ways in which you lay claim? One of the ways in which you lay claim to a place is you say, I can show maps going back to 100 years which show that this always belonged to us. But then, of course, the other party says, well, I'll show you maps too. That's a cartographic war. So when we think of Cold War, you've heard the phrase, of course, it was used in the context here of the Soviet Union and the US having a Cold War. This is a different form of a Cold War. And maps are never to be taken simply as a representation of a reality out there. Like many other artifacts of this kind, they can actually create that reality. You know, how you identify a place, how you mark it, all of this can make a substantial difference in what that actual reality is that you think out there. So here, this in the darker blue here, these are the Dravidian languages. It's a different linguistic family, you know, right? Of course, this is not to say that Greek and Hindi, or let's say Chinese and Hindi, okay, are less different from each other than, let's say, Telugu, which is a language spoken here in Andhra, and Hindi. No. Even though they're all, so Chinese, Telugu, and Hindi are three different linguistic families. Okay? The reason why Telugu and Hindi might still be closer is partly because of loan words. That there were a large number of loan words from Sanskrit which came into even South Indian languages. And of course the reverse could be true as well. There'd be fewer loan words from Chinese that would have come into Hindi. You know, some of us who are interested in culinary history as well have long wondered, you know, there may be 2 or 3 people in this room who know this South Indian dish called the idli, you know. Okay, so it's a steamed dish, a steamed kind of, you know, ball in a way, if I can call it that. So is it like, okay, is this the equivalent of, you know, the Shanghai dumplings, for example? You know, where did the idli come from? Right? That's and you know, and one of the ways in which you might be able to determine these things is looking at what are the words that are used for various things, all right, and whether that might suggest some kind of loan, right, some kind of origin elsewhere, so on and so forth. Anyhow, so here you have the Dravidian languages over here, and then there you have the North Indian languages, which are Indo-Aryan, Indo-Iranian, and then when you're going to get into the mountains, and you'll see now in a map, which will be, because here the detail is you have to really look very carefully, but if you had to look at the broad outlines now, okay, now see what's happening there. I think it's important that we're identifying different linguistic families here. So these are the Indo-Aryan languages, and then here these are the Dravidian languages. You can see it from the key. Now notice, Tibeto-Burman languages, the entire belt from the western Himalayas all the way to the eastern Himalayas. That's over 2,000 kilometers. All right, and down all the way to present-day Myanmar. Right, this is one language family. And this, of course, raises the question, when we say India, whose India are we speaking about? What kind of India are we speaking about? And if someone told me that, look, you know, oh yeah, there's a big difference between Texans and people from Kansas and New Yorkers, well, yes, I know that, but, you know, you all speak English, right? Yeah, and I know there are accents, and I know that there are parts of Texas I can go to, and I might have a little bit of a difficulty with some of that accent. But nonetheless, and you all shop at Costco, and you all eat at McDonald's. Doesn't matter whether you're in Kansas or New York, for Christ's sake, right? I mean, the degree of homogenization in this country is enormous, frankly, enormous, if you think about it. Here you're really speaking about something that is quite different. The magnitude of difference is much greater. Because the question really fundamentally arises, what does a person over here in Northeast India have anything to do with a person in Delhi or somewhere in Hyderabad, wherever the case might be, right? And of course, my suggestion, this is a heretical kind of suggestion to some, but this is one of the reasons why India has always been vulnerable. It's been vulnerable because the greater the diversity, the greater the cosmopolitanism, it actually makes you more vulnerable. Particularly when the people coming in are the English, incredibly homogeneous. Incredibly homogeneous. Right? Bad food throughout England. That was one of the many other ways in which they were homogeneous. That was one of the reasons why the British had to colonize India. At least they could eat decently for the first time, in centuries, right? But here you see what we're speaking about is we're speaking about linguistic groups that are extremely different. And then, of course, the question arises, what makes the people of the Himalayan region, all the way from there, from the west Himalayas to the east, what really makes them have something in common with the rest of India? Questions to think about. Here, the languages of India. Now, this map it breaks it up. So major, languages, but Marathi. So this is where the three language formula would have come in, right? So Marathi would have been predominantly the language of Maharashtra, Kannada. This would the state of Karnataka. This is the predominant language, and Tamil here, so on and so forth. All of these PowerPoints will be made available to you, so you can look at them at your leisure. And here, we see this in different scripts, because then there's also the question of script. For example, 90% of the people living in Pakistan and the people living in North India, they all speak the same language, more or less. Sometimes it's called Hindi, sometimes it's called Urdu. The real word for it is Hindustani, actually, because it's the common language. But in Pakistan, it is written in a script which I cannot read unless I've learned the language. And Hindi is written in the Devanagari script. Okay? It's written in the Devanagari script. So this is the script that I'm talking about over here. These words here, this is the Devanagari script over here. And the reason why this looks completely different is because you are talking about Tibetan, Burman language family here, right? And if you're looking at this script here, these are all the South Indian languages, the Dravidian languages, completely different scripts, And so when we are looking at the linguistic diversity, it's not only who's speaking what language, but then also what script that language is actually written in. All right? So that gives you a sense of the problem. And one thing that I am introducing as a cautionary note, because I'll fall into that problem myself sometimes, and it's inescapable, which is that when one is speaking of India, sometimes when one's making a larger argument, one is really speaking of a certain kind of India, a certain portion of India. The argument may not work for the whole country as a such. All right? But you have to keep that in mind, that when we are thinking there's a big divide between urban India and rural India. There's a divide between South India with its Dravidian languages and North India. The very substantial divide in many ways. And this is not to say that there may not be some things that are pan-Indian, right? And then we'd have to determine. So, for example, does the Constitution of India create a pan-Indian identity? Right? Most people think that the pan-Indian identity comes from religion. From being a Hindu. Well, then there are Hindus all over. But the word Hindu was never used to describe himself or herself by a person until the 18th century. So these are some caveats to keep in mind. Now, before I get into the 1940s, let me give you a very brief, very, very brief capsule account. So the British come to India, and there is a difference between speaking of the British and the English, but here, for the sake of convenience, I'm just collapsing it. The difference is that when you say British, it includes the Scots and the Irish as well, and they had a considerable role to play in the colonization of India as well, and sometimes a disproportionately big role to play. One of the reasons for that also has to do with the fact that colonization very often did entail brutalization. You have to put people down as well. Of course, there are many forms of colonization. But I dare say, this is a general theory, which you are under no obligation to accept at all. You can think about it. But I think that people who have been brutalized are more likely to brutalize others in turn. I think the Irish are a very good example of that. The Irish were doubtless brutalized by the English. In fact, the Great Potato Famine, in consequence of which a substantial number of Irish migrated to the United States. Right? Irish, you can look at the charts and you see the Irish migration is going to go up dramatically, beginning with the failure of the potato in Ireland. And this is going to continue. And I mean, their entire Irish countryside was just denuded, particularly of young males. You couldn't find a single young male. They had all migrated, or if they hadn't died. The Irish, and this famine was partially a consequence of English policies, laissez-faire policies. All right? I don't have the time to really enter into a big discussion of that right now, but there's a general agreement about the degree to which the English were culpable by using free market economy policies in Ireland and not doing anything. And the Irish then, I'm describing as people who've been brutalized, are going to play a disproportionately big role, given their small numbers, when they come to India. And you can see that it's going to be a lot of the Scots and the Irish who are going to be involved in some of the worst atrocities committed in India during the colonial period. Right? So there are complexities of that kind. But here I'm simply saying that British, English, right now I'm just using these interchangeably. The British come to India beginning in the early 1600s, very small numbers. They come as traders, and over the course of the century, through the 1600s, they get established in India in various ways. They're not a political power, but the East India Company. So they came as traders, working under the auspices of the East India Company. The East India Company received a charter from the Queen, Elizabeth, on 31st December 1600, and that enabled them to come to India as traders. And India held out a great many attractions for them. It is an indisputable fact that there were a great many things that the English wanted from India, and that there was nothing that India wanted from England. Absolutely nothing. So if you have a trade going on, well, something has to be given in return. It was bullion. It was bullion. It was basically gold or silver. Same thing with China for a long period of time, right? And for those of you who've done world history and you know something about the opium wars of the 19th century, a lot of that has to do with this too, right? Because if you're getting opium from India, it's going to China. What's going to happen there is this kind of triangular trade which we were speaking about in the 19th century. But the reason why opium becomes important is because the trade which had started much earlier, what England was sending to China was again bullion, and mainly silver. And England was on the gold standard, so it was very expensive for England, because first they had to buy silver on the open market and then send it to China in return for tea, silk, porcelain, for example, things they were getting from China. Because again, what did the English have that the Chinese wanted? Nothing. And it's mainly bullion. And eventually then they're going to substitute opium in place of bullion. Because when India falls under colonial rule, right, the opium trade is going to become important, and the British realize that you can actually now get all of this stuff in exchange for opium. And so India is going to become a major opium producing center. I mean, there was always opium, but not on the scale that you're going to find in the 19th century. So the English come as traders, working for the East India Company, and by the 1700s, much earlier in fact, but I'm rounding it out, by the early 1700s, they have established themselves in quite a few different places, mainly on the coasts, mainly along the coastal regions. And one of the ways in which you do the trade is, of course, you get material from the interior, and then you send it to the coast, and then from there it's put on, obviously, a ship and sent overseas, right? 1757 is what is viewed as the conventional mark at the point at which the British get transformed from being traders to rulers. Long process, but the long process in the sense that obviously it took 150 years, but also there were complicated negotiations. And this is where, if I may go back to the point I made 15-20 minutes ago, this is where I think the question of vulnerability becomes important. So there's a battle. It's called the Battle of Plassey, 1757. The East India Company is going to send one of its major figures, a man known as Clive, Robert Clive. Right? And he's going to enter into a dispute with an Indian ruler who is the Nawab. The Nawab is a ruler of Bengal. He's a Muslim ruler. Siraj-ud-Dawla, he's a young man. Siraj-ud-Dawla is quite infuriated. You don't need to write any of this down. Don't worry about it, because you're not going to get tested. This is just the backdrop for you. Okay? Right? The Siraj-ud-Dawla is going to tell the East India Company that, look, you have built an establishment here, and you've fortified it. You've attached artillery and all of that, and you've got to remove it. This is my terrain. The British are not going to agree to that. There's eventually going to be a conflict. The major part of the story from the Indian standpoint is that there are Indians who are going to betray Siraj-ud-Dawla. Okay? So British rule begins with this story of betrayal and traitors, right? That's at least what the nationalist narrative in India would like to believe, right? And that has been the standard narrative. Now, it is important, because I would say to you, this is where you always have to do a little bit more work of interpretation yourself. See, why is it, for example, that an Indian would say, hey, I'm willing to betray my fellow Indians, right, to help the British? Now, there were many such conflicts where the French were involved too. Part of the reason has to do precisely with the fact that what we take to be identity was never a matter so easily resolved in the 18th century in India. This idea that I'm an Indian and I should be loyal to all other Indians is an idea that frankly never had much traction in India at all. I'm not sure it has a lot of traction even today, actually. And I'm not unhappy at that, because nationalism is a disease in whatever shape or form it occurs wherever in the world, as far as I'm concerned. But that's a long story, right? That the point is that if you remember, you look at this here. I mean, if you're from here, you speak one language, and you get there are people from here belonging to a different linguistic group, right? Why should this person be viewed as any more or less Indian or less alien or more alien than a Britisher? It's not clear, really, frankly. Okay? So this idea of national loyalties or even sub-regional loyalties, I think, was not something that had taken shape in the 18th century, right? And certainly not in the centuries preceding that. But now there are ways to complicate that, because there were, of course, always words used to designate the foreigner. So when the Muslims came, some of them were called Yavanas, which is a kind of a word to designate the alien. Turushkas, okay, the Turks, essentially. So I'm not saying that there's never been the sense of the outsider, but we'd have to try to understand whether that outsider was understood in the ways in which we ordinarily understand the idea of the outsider, you see? Right? What are the boundaries between the self and the other? That's one way to think of it, if you had to put it in a slightly more philosophical register. All right? So 1757, the British establish themselves in this part, only in Bengal, and gradually their rule is going to expand. And now it needs to be said also, and I'll show you another slide at this juncture now. So if you look at this map here, pre-partition, pre-1947, August 1947, so you notice from the key here that there are only two colors, right? So everything in pink designates what were called native states or princely states, by which I mean very simply that from the time that the British started commanding territories in India directly, beginning in 1757, gradual wars of expansion. It takes several decades. It's going to be the early 1800s before you could say substantial chunks of India had come into their hands. These wars of expansion and annexation and acquisition are going to continue through the 1830s, 40s, 50s. Okay? Now, even at that time and moving into the late 19th century, the British had a policy. That policy was that they were going to leave certain areas under the rule of the native ruler. Okay? Now, we have to be very clear what that means. It does not mean that the ruler of Hyderabad, and this is a huge chunk, we're not talking about something very small. When you look over here, it says Rajasthan, Gujarat, and Central India, and the pink here suggests these were princely states. There were actually over 100 princely states. These were all independent kingdoms. Mohandas Gandhi was born in one such princely state, in Kathiawar. Okay? Some of them would be, no, this is not an exaggeration, the size of the UCLA campus. Okay? The very small ones, tiny ones. And then some would have been gigantic, the size of North Dakota or South Dakota or one of these states. Okay? The size could vary enormously. And of course the princes were ranked depending on how big your properties were and all of that. There were a great many other things. So what does this all mean? What this means is that even at the height of their power, the British basically held 2/3 of the country directly under their rule. What it says British India there, all the portion in that yellowish green, right? The rest were all princely states. The rest were princely states, which meant that the ruler had jurisdiction over his people, but he did not have sovereignty. There is a difference between jurisdiction and sovereignty. The rulers of these states did not have the authority to conduct foreign relations with a foreign power, because that's the sign of sovereignty. They could even they could do a great many things. They could determine education, irrigation, agriculture in their own state, but they could not enter into relations with a foreign power. Right? They could not enter into a war with a foreign power. So that was the agreement between the British and these princely states. And of course it was mutually beneficial because the native rulers thought, we have limited degree of sovereignty. The British knew that they had a set of loyal people and who they did not have to expend huge amounts of money governing them directly, because it's much more expensive to govern them directly. You had a question, or has it been answered?
Largely answered, but were these princely states required to give resources to the British Empire?
They could at times, yes. It all depended. I mean, many of them volunteered their forces during wars. They were if let's say example. Let's supposing you have armed revolutionaries in British India. We're talking about now the nationalist period. The British are on the hunt for them. They go and they take refuge in a princely state. Then what would they do? The government of British India would ask for them to be extradited, and usually they would be. Yeah. All right, but we're not looking at any of this in huge detail, right? Right? I'm just giving you the general, that if you're looking at the pre-partition map and you're thinking to yourself, well, what does it mean, princely states? But that was the situation, and it's important to understand that, because that will help us understand a particular problem that is going to come about. All right, here's another map which shows you once again India before partition. Notice once again that this map divides it into British India and then Indian states and territories. The contours are not exactly identical to the previous one, but you get an idea. However, now let's go back. So 19th century, first half of the 19th century, I've mentioned to you that the British are engaged in this task of expansion. All of that. 1857-58, you have a mutiny, usually known as the Indian Rebellion now of 1857-58, a huge threat as the British saw it. They're going to eventually suppress it. Brutalities on both sides. They're going to suppress it. The chief implication of this is that India is no longer going to be ruled by a company, by the East India Company. Of course, there's an argument to be made, which I don't have the time to get into here, which is that the East India Company, even though nominally it was ruling India all the way till 1857, Parliament was increasingly exercising control. So it was really the British Parliament that was overseeing the company. But officially, India was ruled by a company. Okay? Now, 1857, 1858, you have the rebellion. The company goes into oblivion, wiped out. And India becomes what's called a crown colony. So now India is directly under the British monarch. In fact, Victoria, who was the empress, is going to, in 1877, she's going to add to her hundreds of titles Empress of India, right, as well. She's also Empress of India then, officially, in the 1870s. So 1858 to onwards, first 15, 20 years, it's still the post-rebellion period. Everyone is recuperating. It had been a brutal war. The British are trying to bring some semblance of law and order as they see it. Indians are licking their wounds. That's what they're doing, frankly. A number of universities are founded at this point in time. Okay, University of Allahabad, for example, University of Calcutta. University of Delhi is going to be a bit later. University of Bombay, University of Madras. These are all colonial period institutions, all of them. Right? They are going to be founded. So that because the Queen had promised after the suppression of the rebellion that she was going to try to treat her Indian subjects much like she treated her own subjects back in Britain. That never happened, but that's beside the point. Right? So, but nonetheless, there's a proclamation that's issued, and this is generally viewed as a period of social reconstruction, recuperation, and all of that. By the 1880s, some Indian elites are saying to themselves, well, we should have some role to play in governing our own country. So this, you can say, is the beginnings of the quest for self-determination. Right? Rudimentary beginnings. No one is really thinking of, a nationalist movement, a revolution, anything of that kind. There's an organization that's going to be founded in 1885 called the Indian National Congress. It still exists today. a mere shadow of what it was, but it still exists today. And be on the lookout for it when you read the news about the elections. Okay? Right? In principle, it's the same organization that goes back to 1885. At that point, it was an organization of elites. They were mainly lawyers. The first 70, 80 people who joined up were all lawyers, all trained in England. And then gradually, the numbers are going to increase a bit. But by the 1890s, a mere decade after the founding of the INC, Indian National Congress, or the Congress as I'm going to call it now, henceforth, for the rest of the class, mere decade after the founding of the Congress, there were people, Indians, who were saying that, look, this is not getting us anywhere, because what is the Congress demanding? The Congress is demanding that Indians should have a slightly greater role in governing themselves. What would be an illustration of that? An illustration of that was that if you wanted to join the civil services, right? The civil services are the bureaucratic, right? The bureaucrats. You have a civil services in the US too, as I hope all of you know. No one ever talks about it, but you have a civil services here, right? I mean, who are the people who work for the State Department? Most of them are professional civil servants. That's what they are. They're always political appointments as well, right? I mean, this guy who heads Pompeo, he's just some guy that Trump plucked out of somewhere, some ignorant fellow, right? And, that's a political appointment. But it is civil servants. The vast majority of all the units of a state are run by civil servants. Well, guess what? In India, an Indian who wanted to take the exam for the Indian civil service had to go to London. I mean, can you believe it? But that was the case. So how many Indians were going to sit on a boat and spend, 500 pounds or whatever it was and 6 months of their life, right, going, and who had the money for it? And what you had these young Englishmen who were coming sometimes in their early 20s. In their early 20s, they didn't know a single Indian language, and they would be appointed district collector of an entire district with 1 million people, And so some fellow in his early 20s was ruling an entire district, dispensing justice. That was the scenario. Now, of course, this is again simply an illustration of the demand. So the demand was that Indians should be permitted to take the exam in India, there should be more Indians allowed into the civil services, and that it's not enough to petition, Nowadays, a form of petition is not on the streets. Now it's, you get 10 emails on the day, sign this petition or that petition. That's petitioning, right? So some of these Indians started taking to more radical methods. And you have the beginnings of armed revolutionary conflict. And there I have, again, my own, little take on that, because many of these Indian nationalists, they're patriots. We can admire them for that. But, they would build these homemade bombs. 50% of the time, they ended up blowing themselves, frankly. These were people who picked up these rudimentary skills. There was no internet. Nowadays, you can learn how to make a bomb. Just go to the internet. You'll get a full manual there for that. But, they sort of picked it up from here and there, and they often blew themselves up. A lot of people have sort of romanticized them. They didn't really do much, frankly, if you ask me, not in that early phase, but what they did do was they pointed to the limitations of official nationalism. Official nationalism means petitioning, going to the viceroy saying, "Dear sir, would you please consider our grievances," that sort of thing. Now, the Congress is going to be transformed into a mass organization under Mohandas Gandhi. There were other instances of that. In the state of Maharashtra, in western India, over here, right here, there's an Indian nationalist by the name of Tilak who's quite important, and he's going to be able to mobilize people partly through religion, and there's going to be a mass movement there. But what Gandhi was able to do was to introduce mass politics in the country as a whole. Okay? This is not the occasion for me to get into Gandhi. I'll just alert you to the fact that I teach a whole course just on him, and it's all on YouTube. So if you want more details on what he was doing and how he was mobilizing, just go to the appropriate lecture, on my YouTube channel, and you'll get that. All right. Key thing simply is this: that you have by 1920 you have a mass-based resistance movement to the British along the very distinct and unique lines argued by Gandhi, who was, of course, a theorist and practitioner of the idea of mass nonviolent resistance, right? So this wasn't just any resistance movement. And this is going to persist for the next 2 decades. Now, this is a capsule account. That's why we're so quickly now into the 1930s now. 1939 is the onset of World War II, right? World War II. Before we get to that, let me also alert you to another interesting little thing, which again shows the fact that when you're a colonized people, you have very little control over your own destiny. World War I, 1 million Indians fought in it. What for? India itself is colonized. But when Britain went to war, the British Empire went to war. It wasn't just Britain. In Britain they have this heroic story. Yeah, just go to all the British museums in London and you'll see that heroic story. World War II, determined island people led by this cigar-smoking Churchill, venerated, the greatest hero of the 20th century. Well, it wasn't just the British who fought, it was the British Empire. 87,000 Indians killed in World War II. 57,000 killed in World War I, when India itself is a colony. And I'm not even including all the other colonized people. What about all the people from Africa who fought? Right? Because when Britain declared war, then the whole idea was that all Britain's colonies are also going to now be at war with Germany or whoever your opponent is. So 1939, and this is important now because now we are starting to get close to the 40s. 1939, onset of World War II, the Congress adopted a position of neutrality. And it adopted a position of neutrality partly because they held to the view, which I do agree with myself, namely that a colonized people do not have the luxury of distinguishing between good imperialists and good colonizers and bad colonizers. Right? Yes, someone could say it's clear as daylight that you have to pick the British over the Nazis. Well, it's not clear as daylight if you've been ruled by the British for 200 years. Not clear as daylight at all. Right? And of course there were all kinds of colonial atrocities all over, Next week is going to be the 100th anniversary of the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. 100th anniversary, April 13th, when 379 Indians, by British count, the Indian count is much higher. There's always a politics of numbers, right? It's like, how many people appeared. Trump will always tell you 2 million people appeared, right? And, the others will say, no, only 100,000. That's what I mean by the politics of numbers. So there's a politics of numbers here too, So I'm just taking the official British tally. 379, all shot down in cold blood in 10 minutes. The general who perpetrated the massacre, General Dyer, he took 2 tanks with him. He couldn't use the tanks because the entrance to the place where they were gathered was too narrow. But he said in his own testimony, when he was called to testify, that, hey, if the entrance had been wider, I would have taken the tanks and I would have used them. I would have machine gunned every single one of them down if I could. There were 15,000 Indians gathered there, right? So we should never get into this game of distinguishing between different kinds of imperialists for this purpose. And the Congress view was a view of neutrality. Now, I have to introduce another element into the picture. This is going to be exceedingly important and will have implications as we move along. Okay, and that is the whole question of Hindus and Muslims in India. So the Congress Party was a nationalist organization representing all Indians. Hindus, Muslims, Christians, Sikhs, anglicized, non-anglicized, urban, rural. It was a nationalist organization that claimed allegiance of all Indians. But by the early 20th century, the Muslims in India began to be encouraged by the British to think of themselves as having a distinct identity. Now, it is not an accident that the Viceroy is the person who rules India, right? That the Viceroy and his senior officials met with a senior delegation of senior Muslim officials and thinkers in 1906. And if you read the records of that, it is very clear that the British said, why don't you form your own political organization? The implication being that the Congress does not represent you. Okay? And they did. They founded what was going to be known as the Muslim League. They founded the Muslim League. Now, yes?
What makes you say it was solely British influence to form the Muslim League? Wouldn't there be more factors than just that?
Oh, no, look. Obviously, there were Muslims who were interested. I'm saying that it was at the instigation of the British that the Muslim League is going to be founded. I'm also saying that if you look at the history, okay, this is tacit. Didn't spell it out because that's what we're going to do when we look at the whole section on communalism. There's a whole week dedicated to this subject. Okay, but the British implication was, I'm glad you asked the question though at this time. The British view was that, look, in India, the Hindus and the Muslims constitute two different communities, and they have been different from time immemorial. Okay? They've been different from time immemorial. Now, I'll give you what the British view was. You might think of it as a caricature in one sentence. All right? In one sentence. And it's not really a caricature. The British view was you can distinguish the Hindus and the Muslims by understanding that the Muslim loves to eat the cow and the Hindu loves to worship the cow. Right? Because, the cow is holy, right? For a Hindu, its consumption of beef meat is obviously taboo for a practicing Hindu, as pork would be for a Muslim or a Jew, right? For a Jewish person. But the British view was, the cow is walking down the street, Muslim, he just is, ecstatic urge to eat the cow because he loves this meat. The Hindu will fall down on his feet and start praying before it. It sounds like a caricature, right? But that was it. That was the formula that they had. This was intended to indicate the fact that these are two separate nations. This is a two-nation theory. These are two separate nations. There's nothing common between them at all. I think it's an entirely false theory, entirely false. But of course, we're going to have to see how we're going to construct the history of Hindu-Muslim relations in India. So the idea was the British are now telling the Muslims, look, the Congress doesn't represent you. You have to look out for yourself. And it's not an accident that nationalism is becoming a major force. Now, when nationalism is becoming a major force, there is tacitly the implication, the understanding that at some point we may not be able to contain this nationalism. So the idea is you now nip it in the bud. You arrest this problem now, because if you tell the Muslims that you have nothing in common with the Congress and with the Hindus, you're creating now a rift within the Indian community.
Wasn't the rift already there? There was a lot of sectarian violence.
No, but
there were more reasons for the
See, but that's exactly what I'm saying. This, you would have to understand how the British constructed a whole narrative. We'd have to understand what was the history of relations between Hindus and Muslims in India over a period of time. So we're not going to resolve this with the back and forth right now, because you'll have to go through a set of readings and you'll have to understand the nature of the argument as it develops, right? Okay? But I would also say we should be a little bit too cautious in thinking that yes, there were always conflicts, because one of the things we also have to understand, that's why the colonial period, we have to begin with the colonial period, is that the unfortunate thing is that many of the frameworks for understanding Indian history all came to us from the British, including this very idea that these people were just fighting each other all the time, you know. And the British themselves had this view because that was their history. It was their history. It was a history of Europe. It was a history of religious sectarian conflict in Europe. They assumed that because there had been this religious sectarian conflict for centuries in Europe, which it was, you know, the Reformation, the Counter-Reformation, you name it, you know, the bloody wars, okay, religious wars in Europe, they assumed that this was actually the Indian past as well. And I'm suggesting to you that that interpretation has been very seriously contested by people who have been working on this question for a long time, you know. Someone else had their hand up, I thought, here. No, okay. All right. But if you have doubts, you can continue to hold on to them and see if you get any closer to having them resolved by the end of the class, all right, by the end of the term. Now, 1939, the point is that when the Congress declared neutrality, the Muslim League did not. Muslim League did not. And in fact, what happened was the Congress went into what we might call a wilderness. That is that it became isolated, partly because in 1942, Gandhi launched the last anti-colonial agitation, the last large anti-colonial agitation, and that is called the Quit India Movement, launched on 8th August 1942. And as the phrase quit India should suggest to you, Gandhi basically told the British, you just get out. You leave us to our problems. Because the British claim was, we can't leave India now because you guys are all going to finish each other up. And of course, there were other factors. But this, I have to simplify. I hope you understand that what were the other factors? For example, you had the Japanese coming in here, into Burma. So, of course, the British were saying there's the threat of Japanese invasion of India. Right? And we're here. Remember, the British are setting themselves as protecting India. Protecting Hindus from Muslims, protecting Muslims from Hindus, protecting, of course, Indian women from Indian men. This is the standard trope. They're basically the guardian angels, you know. And now they're going to protect the whole country from, you know, the Japanese. Never mind that they couldn't hold on to Singapore and it would just fell like that, you know. If you really look at the British record there, it wasn't very, very wholesome, if I may put it this way, right? But that was the claim. So 1942, Quit India Movement. What is the British response? Immediately arrest all the top leaders of the Congress, including Gandhi. Immediately. A sweep. Thousands of people arrested overnight. And that's what I mean with the wilderness. Because what happens is Congress is now kind of out of the picture. Right? Their top leaders have all been sent into jail. Of course, there's an underground movement of those who are still, able to escape the dragon net. And what's going to happen is that the Muslim League will become exceedingly important in these 2-3 years that the Congress is in the wilderness. Now, when we get to 1944, they're going to be released. 1945, the end of the war. At the end of the war, it was very clear that the British could not really hold on to India. And so at that point, the negotiations for Indian independence are going to begin. Okay, and they have a slide here which I've mentioned some of the elements. There's no time to go over all of these, but negotiations for Indian independence, because of course the critical question for us, well, there's several critical questions, one of which I've anticipated, and that has to do with the question of the Hindu-Muslim divide, and how this was going to be addressed, because over the years, particularly during the years of the war, and particularly 1942 to 44, the Muslim League became even more important than it had been before, and the demand arises among some people in the Muslim League for the creation of a Muslim majority state, which is going to be called Pakistan. Okay? Now, this is the first fundamental set of questions that arises. How was the partition? Because if you're going to create a state, a Muslim majority state, how are you going to carve it out of India? And you might say to yourself, well, have someone sit there and determine it. No. Why? Of course, eventually it was a group of people who sat down and determined it. But what were the problems? The first fundamental problem is the Muslims are not just in one place. Right? If all the Muslims, right, if we said, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to carve out a Hispanic state from LA. So you say, all right, I'm going to take East LA because that's where a greater Hispanic population is, and that will be, but you know how many Hispanics there are in the San Fernando Valley? Yeah, hundreds of thousands. They're all over. Of course, you could say that East LA, a greater number, right? But they're all over. Now, if you look at a map of India over here, so let's go back to a map which shows the cities. Okay, here, this one over here. Okay, Hyderabad, big Muslim population. Okay, now if you go to Allahabad over here, big Muslim population. Right? If you go to Ahmedabad over here, huge Muslim population. Delhi in the north over there, right, the capital, Muslim population. So what's going to happen to all of these Muslims? Now this is only the beginning. This is the tip of the iceberg here, because you have huge Muslim populations, and let me go to my cursor over here. So you have huge Muslim populations on the west here, in the western Punjab, and of course going all the way into present day Pakistan, right? But you also had a huge Muslim population in eastern Bengal. Eastern Bengal was actually more Muslim, and that's what is eventually going to become Bangladesh, right? So this is Bengal over here, and the western Bengal was more Hindu, but there are Muslims there. Eastern Bengal was more Muslims, but there are Hindus there. So if you're going to carve out a country, how are you going to carve it out? Right? That is a problem that they had to think through. And the solution they came up with was no solution. You could argue, if you look at what's happening in politics today, you could argue that if you want to take that view. So what did they do? There were various, we don't have the luxury of looking at all the proposals and all the negotiations. We're not interested in that. What we're interested in is trying to understand a number of logics involved in this. First is the idea, which I think should be contested. And I've already contested it for you. The idea of the two-nation theory, that the Hindus and Muslims constitute two separate nations. Right? Okay. But now let's say it's a fait accompli. The Muslims, or a certain number of Muslims, are saying we're not going to settle for anything less than an independent state. Okay? And so what is eventually going to happen is they're going to carve out a state over there in the west, And part of that state will be here. Now, there's something really quite an anomaly. You know, we always used to say that if you were a Pakistani school child growing up in Pakistan before 1971, I say before 1971 because in 1971 what happened was, so this became East Pakistan. On August 14th, 1947, this became East Pakistan and that was West Pakistan. It's one country, however, one country. It just, for sake of convenience, you call that West Pakistan and then you call this East Pakistan, what is now called Bangladesh. That before 1971, if you were a Pakistani school child and somebody said, as part of your geography exercise, draw a map of Pakistan. How would you draw the map? You would have to first draw the map of India, if you ask me. Because otherwise what you'd be doing is, you'd be saying, oh, this is Pakistan, right? This portion here and here. That doesn't look like a country to me or a map. What? You'd have to do that. The only way you can define it is first you draw India, as it were, and then you say, this is Pakistan. Right? Here are two fragments, one there and one over here. All right? And what's the logic? Muslim majority. That there are majority of Muslims there. Of course, there were a great many people who are going to be, and how did they draw the line? Extraordinarily interesting. I'd also do a whole course just on the partition. Just on the partition. So I'm encapsulating what I do in 28 hours, I'm doing in 10 minutes right now for you. Okay? What is going to be really extraordinary is they bring a man to India who has never been to India before, who is going to be the head of what is called the Boundary Commission. His name is Radcliffe. There's a fantastic poem by W.H. Auden, the great 20th century poet, one of the great 20th century poets. Just read it, called Partition. And this man that they brought out, his chief qualification was he had never been to India. And he was going to divide up this whole country and figure out where the Muslims are going to be and where the Hindus were going to be. Right? And not only had he never been to India, he positively despised India. He loathed India. You read his diary, and all he can talk about is, I'm in Delhi and I've got what they call Delhi belly. You know, diarrhea, running, it's hot, the mosquitoes are bothering me. Damn it, man, I've got to preside over the destiny of 100 million people. How soon can I get out of here? That's what he's writing in his diary. I mean, it's a mockery of how they went about it. What was the theory? I'm going to end on that. Why did they bring someone from who knew nothing and who had no interest in it? And why did they have to go to someone in Scotland? He was a Scottish judge. Because the theory was he is transcendent. Meaning what? Meaning, if we get someone with Indian experience, you know what's going to happen? The Hindus are going to shout in this year and say, no, draw the line there, leave more to India. The Muslims are going to shout in this year. And this person will never be neutral. Even an Englishman who was always claimed to be objective, neutral, transcendent, like the Queen, right, could not be neutral in India because these damn Indians are polluting and contaminating you, right? That was the British theory. So you bring someone out from there because he's going to be 100% objective and neutral. And he's going to draw the boundaries. So this is how the partition came about. I'm going to have to continue on this